Hey there everyone, what's up? I am back today with another impressions video, and this one is the third part of the Shining series games on the PSP. That would be Shining Ark. And Shining Ark, as I said, it's the third PSP game, and I have recently talked about the other two, Shining Hearts and Shining Blade. And the last one released here was Shining Ark. And this is the latest Shining game released as of right now. There is another one coming pretty soon, Shining Resonance, but I guess it's not in the same world, so it's apparently like a different world. Though Shining Ark doesn't quite have the same connection between the games as Shining Hearts and Shining Blade did. So, as I mentioned in the previous videos, Shining Blade and Shining Heart have a lot of characters, and Shining Wind also, which is on the PS2, it's like the same world, and they're all connected because all the characters keep showing up and mention events from the past. And I assumed Shining Ark would be like that too, but when I went into it, there's actually no characters from the previous games except for possibly one. But if that one character is, they never mention anything from the previous games, and none of the places are the same. So it could just be like a kind of like a wink and a nod, maybe, like not really the same character. It doesn't really make sense for it to be the same character in the story either, though it's the same kind of appearance and name. But I don't know, besides, it's not really important. But besides that, we've got Shining Ark here. And what can I say about Shining Ark that would differentiate it from Shining Blade and Shining Heart? It's a lot like a cross between Shining Blades and Shining Heart. So you have Shining Blade, as you guys know, I really enjoyed because it was a lot like Valkyria Chronicles, where the battle system was essentially the same as Valkyria Chronicles, and then but it had a lot less of a, I don't know, I wouldn't say less of a story, but it had less, like, extraneous stuff to do, like going around town and baking a lot of bread, like in Shining Hearts. But what this game tries to do is kind of meet somewhere in the middle of those two. So you have Shining Ark, and the bread baking comes back, but it's not as important overall. So in Shining Hearts, it was like the main focus. In Shining Ark, you can do it again. There's more bread baking to be done, but it's not very important. It's kind of, you use them as kind of items to your stuff. So you will be going around collecting items, but you also have like a way to grow fruit and vegetables and things. So you have like a little garden to tend and animals to look after and the bread shop. So that kind of elements are back in the game. There's also fishing again, which was also in the previous games. But what this does is it doesn't focus on it so much, so it doesn't go overboard like Shining Hearts did. It does kind of make a happy medium with that stuff, the kind of elements where you have to go around and collect ingredients and create things. But what it does is it does kind of take a step forward there, because it does make you get into the world a little bit more. But where it takes a step back over Shining Blades is that the battle system is not as good as Shining Blade. It's a bit of a departure from the way it was done before. So in Shining Blade and in Valkyria Chronicles, it's more strategy RPG, but you have a map and it has icons where your characters are, and you can select them, and you have a certain amount of uses for the round. It's not like dependent on the character. You could, if you wanted to use the same character 5 times, you could do that in Shining Blades and in Valkyria Chronicles. But in Shining Ark, it's based on the characters. There's no kind of overmap that you go to, so it's almost, it is turn-based, and you do have like an area you can move to, but you can't select characters by yourself. There's just a kind of order of actions. So one character will go, and then they'll move to the end of the order, like a standard kind of RPG, except you can do things to move people down the order, up the order. But in general, it's based on the character's speed. So if the character is faster, they'll act faster. And you have to use each character once in the round. You don't get to choose which characters you're going to use. You get to use the one that's turn it is. So it gives you a bit less in terms of options. It also, the battles are even smaller than in Shining Blades, where in Shining Blade you had 5 characters in your party at all times. In this game you really have 3 plus 1 extra character, which is kind of useless. And I'll explain that. But when you build your parties, there's a lot less characters in this game than in Shining Blade also. There aren't that many total. I want to say 8. It might be less than that, or a little bit more. I'm not sure. 8 to 10, but I think it's 8. And you kind of go through the game with those characters, and they all level at the same, not the same pace, but they all get experience, whether they participate in the battle or not. So it's different than Shining Blade in the sense that, like, in Shining Blade, if you didn't use the characters, you were screwed. They didn't level up at all. But in Shining Ark, everybody levels up regardless. So it's a bit easier in terms of, like, grinding up characters. Not that you ever had to grind up characters in Shining Blade, but in Shining Ark, it's totally unnecessary. There's, like, never a point in this game where I felt I had to grind, and I never had to, like, swap out characters. I just picked the ones I liked and stuck with them for the most part. But I want to talk about the character differences, because it's really different from in Shining Blade and Shining Hearts, in that Shining Ark has probably, out of the 3 games on the PSP, probably the weakest characters. And that could be different for other people, but I just couldn't really get into these characters. They weren't really interesting, and you have these 2 here. This is Freed and Panis, and Panis is the 4th character who's kind of useless in your party all the time. She always has to be in your party, and when she's in your party, you can't control her, and you can eventually, like in the first part of the game, you can't control her. She just randomly does stuff, and it's mostly useless. Sometimes she does stuff that's good. Sometimes she'll heal you. Sometimes she'll, like, attack with huge magic bursts, and most of the time she'll just run around the stage and trip on stuff, or, like, find items sometimes. She's mostly useless. And then halfway through you can start feeding her bread, so the bread comes back into the game for a little bit, but you can feed her bread to change her attitude. So sometimes she'll be like, you can feed her a certain type of bread and she'll, like, attack more than she normally would, or she'll listen to your orders more than she normally would, or she'll find stuff more than she. It's just depending on what you give her, she'll kind of move in a certain direction. But even then, she doesn't always do what you want, and she doesn't always do what she's kind of set to. So she ends up being more of a nuisance, or just kind of this annoying waste of time that you have. And her character is really annoying too, because she's like one of those characters that talks like a little kid and acts like a little kid. So she's just mostly, like, kind of in the way all the time. You just feel like, I hate this character. And I didn't like the character for the most part until later on in the game, where she kind of changes. But what happens with that is like, later on you actually get to control her as a character, but it's way towards the end of the game. So by the time you can actually control her as a character, it doesn't even really matter anymore. So it's not incredibly useful. So it does feel like you don't have as many options for your party, especially in comparison to Shining Blade. So overall, the combat kind of takes a little bit of a step back in that area. But they did fix a little bit of my complaints from the other one, which were that the kind of easiness of it. I mean, it's still easy. It's not difficult at all, but they did do something that made things, like, a little better, in that the enemies that you fight do more damage now. So you actually, I mean, I never died, but you actually have the feeling like, oh, well, I actually kind of have to pay attention a little bit more because I could die. It's possible. Whereas in Shining Blade, it almost never felt like I was gonna die at some point. But Shining Ark had at least that going for it. And yeah, so what about the graphics? Are pretty much the same as the other game, well, Shining Blade. They're 3D. They look alright. They do kind of reuse some maps a bunch of times in kind of different settings. So like there'll be the desert version of the same map that's usually a winter version. It's stuff like that, but it's not horrible. I mean, there are a lot of missions in the game, so you'll be playing a ton of the maps. So they do repeat, but it doesn't feel so bad because there is a bit of a variety, even though they're repeating. They're really quick. You can kind of snap right through the battles, so it doesn't really feel like, even though you are repeating them, it doesn't feel like incredibly repetitive because, you know, the enemies will change, the types of, like, sometimes there'll be large enemies, sometimes there'll be a million small enemies. It's pretty, you know, it varies up to what's on the stages at least, so it doesn't feel the same even though the stage is essentially the same. You know, they'll change the positions or where the enemies are, so it kind of changes the way you would run through the stage. So it does a good job, even though it's kind of a bit of a reuse. It does a good job of making it feel like it's not so repetitive. I'm trying to think. Music is okay. Voice acting is good. That was a good point about it, actually. I liked the character voices and how they interacted with each other, and the story itself wasn't bad. And I'm saying it wasn't bad towards the end, because through the whole thing I was thinking, God, I can't get into this game. Can't get into the story at all. And and it took a long time for me to get through the story to the point where I thought, like, oh, I guess it's pretty good. It dragged a long time where you're kind of doing the same thing in the beginning a lot over and over in the story. Like, you're going around to different places searching for these kind of ruins, and you do that in a lot of cases, so it feels like half the game is just repeating that kind of thing where you're going around and going to these ruins, and then like the mid part of the game it kind of changes up what you're doing. But you know, it felt really slow because, you know, halfway through the game is like 15 hours of play, and then like after 15 hours you're finally like, oh, I guess there's kind of a story going on here, and they kind of like try to throw some curves in at you, which is, it's nice. It wasn't like totally unpredictable, but you know, they did a good job of trying to throw in some swerves in there. So I don't know, I felt like at the end of the story was actually pretty good. They kind of ruined it a little bit with like an after the credits ending sequence, but had it ended without that, it probably would have been like much higher on the story list, because it would have been like a pretty cool ending for this type of game. But it didn't really. It kind of ended. I thought it was going to end in this kind of like really bittersweet tone, where like, you know, they kind of win but they lose. But it didn't actually end. It didn't actually end that way. So that was a kind of a disappointment, because I thought like it would have been a much stronger if it ended that way, but it didn't. Yeah. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Everything besides that is pretty similar to Shining Blade, where you can still create your own weapons. You can still kind of go around town and talk to people and get lots of kind of submissions and delivery tasks, which the delivery tasks aren't all bread this time, which is different from Shining Hearts. You actually have to like maybe find some people in town and give them something, or sometimes they want bread though, so it does kind of bring that back from Shining Hearts. But beyond that, Shining Ark was pretty good. Out of these three games, if I had to recommend only one of them, if you're just like, I want to try a Shining game on the PSP, but I don't want to play all of them, I would recommend Shining Blade. That was the most fun for me. But Shining Ark, if you liked Shining Hearts and you played through it and you thought, like, oh, I kind of like the bread baking, I like the kind of slow pace of it, Shining Ark is probably something you would like a lot. Whereas Shining Blade is a lot more, you know, strategy RPG heavy. There's a lot less of the kind of simulation elements from Shining Hearts. And Shining Ark kind of is a nice balance between the two. But for me, it ended up being a bit less fun than Shining Blade, which I, just played. So yeah, that's about it. That's all I want to say about the Shining games on the PSP. I've wanted to play these for a long time. These three here, and there's not a lot of people on YouTube who've talked about them. So I figured I'd give it a shot, see if anybody cares about Shining. I always hear a lot of people saying like, "Oh, Sega doesn't make any more Shining games." Well, they do. They make one almost every year, at least recently. And, it's like every year to a year and a half there's a new Shining game. And I think this one came out in, like, 2012, maybe? I can't find a date. But it might be even 2013. But, yeah, Shining Ark is, pretty good game. So, Sega's still pumping out the Shining games. They're just not localizing them. And maybe the next one is on the PS3, not the PSP or the Vita, so Shining Resonance is that next one. Hopefully that will be good. I hope it uses the same kind of system as Shining Blade, actually. If it's more like Shining Blade than Shining Ark, I'd be pretty happy. But when that one comes out, I'll probably buy it and do another impressions video. But until then, that's the end of Shining stuff for the near future. So yeah, next impressions video is going to be Vita stuff, because it's the Vita deluge here in Japan this summer. So there is tons and tons of Vita games coming out, and I'll be playing a bunch of them. So expect a lot of those, and some other surprise stuff too. But yeah, until then, I will catch you guys next time.